Hangouts and helping bring that into more spaces. Recently, she was at the Flatiron School, where she was the Senior Director of Product Management and Design. So the Flatiron School, if you haven't heard of it, does a lot of coding boot camps and everything related to CS in general. And right now she is the head of remote learning at Facebook. So we're really excited to have you here and really excited to learn more about your day-to-day journey, your day-to-day life and journey into how you got into your current position and what you kind of hope to accomplish in the future in terms of remote learning. So the first question that we had, it's a very general question. So what does your day-to-day job duty / task look like? So at a typical day as the head of remote learning, how does it go?
Well, I guess I'm sure you get this a lot, but there is actually not a really typical day here. I think most jobs in tech, and especially I think a lot of the ones today are a lot of just like different problem solving that you're doing at various times in a day. I mean, I have like kind of core hours that I try to keep to just to sort of have some sanity and sort of like some work-life balance. So typically my day usually starts around workday starts around like 9:30. One of the really neat things about my role is I'm part of like a pretty global team. So I have teammates in London, teammates here in New York, where I am based, teammates in Austin, and a lot of teammates in Menlo Park. And so in the morning, I'm usually having some of those meetings and conversations with folks in the kind of EMEA London office. And then kind of at the end of my day, I'm having some of the conversations with the folks kind of out on the West Coast. And so that's really nice. It's really nice to kind of like have those kind of global presence in the things that we're working on, and certainly in the field that sort of I'm in now with remote. That perspective is really valuable. I don't think we can be realistically doing anything sort of remote work without considering some of the advantages of it, which is sort of being able to kind of bring together a really global workforce or a group of like global learners. And so there's some of that stuff that is still fairly new, even at Facebook, to think about, not think about kind of like post-COVID, like all the challenges there are, but sort of like what are those opportunities. And so just going back to your question, like, so my day sort of starts at like 9:30 and sort of wraps up by 6:30-ish. Sometimes I'll have stuff that I have to kind of wrap up at night, but most times I'm really kind of offline there. And I would say meetings that I have are usually either one-on-ones with folks, and those are sort of just like relationship building and trying to understand how best my work can support their area of focus. Sometimes they're more like brainstorming, problem solving meetings where we kind of come together and say, okay, like this thing came up, like how do we solve for it? And like bring in folks with different expertise. So engineers or designers or people who have like kind of domain expertise. And so I do a lot of facilitation to try to make sure we get the best ideas in the room. And then my least favorite kind of meeting, but they have to happen, are kind of like status updates and like kind of information meetings. I do think we're getting better in general at doing those, because people are like acknowledging they're on video calls all day long, and that's like kind of can be tiring. We try to do a lot of our updates asynchronously. So we have like kind of tracking documents, or we try to use email and chat really heavily to inform folks. So it's good. It's hard because like information sharing comes in so many different forms that if you have like a lot of projects running at once, like you can kind of get lost in it. But we're just sort of sensitive to, this is a very bizarre time for all of us. So being able to give everyone on the team flexibility. So if they need to take care of their children or take care of an elderly person, like Facebook in general has been like super accommodating with that. And so meetings are definitely something that's just part of the job, but we're trying to minimize that, you know, the day has to be like some meetings, but also some focused, like kind of focused work time.
Thank you. That was really insightful. So yeah, our second question was basically what inspired you to go into education, and what kind of motivated you to basically leave the Flatiron School maybe and go into this new initiative by Facebook.
Yeah, sure. So what got me excited about going into, I would say, like education technology as a whole is I'd been at that point in my career, probably like 4 or 5 years at Google, and I really, I kind of got really lucky and ended up at a high tech company in a super high growth period where the team, was just working on a lot of really cool initiatives. And I really liked the aspects of like building products and solving problems. What I was struggling with was trying to connect that to something that felt like kind of very personal to me. I think I told Chris this story, but I'll just share with this group. I was kind of helping the Google Maps team think about how to figure out like food truck data. Food trucks move around and people want to find their food truck. So wouldn't it be great to have those on the Google map? And it was really interesting because there's like technical components to it. There's sort of user behavior components to solving that problem. And so I like was pulling a lot of like really long nights to just like kind of come up with the right solution and thinking about it. But then I think one day I was just kind of like, well, I don't really care. Like, I think people will find their food trucks. Like, there's so many ways people who love food trucks will find their food trucks. And so it kind of occurred to me that like, yes, I love solving interesting problems, but I want to do it in a way that I feel like that I can have impact, and that would be like kind of something that I could be really excited about and really like added to the world. And kind of the other backdrop was I was doing some volunteering at a digital literacy organization here in Brooklyn. And so I was going in on the weekends and teaching students and parents. It was a program for middle schoolers and their parents, how to like do basic digital citizenship stuff, like how to use Word and Excel, and how to do Google searches, or how to, at the time, kind of start doing video calls. And it was important for middle schoolers and their parents to be doing this together because we saw a lot of kind of like digital literacy gaps happen around middle school, where the kids start to use the computers more and more, but parents felt really intimidated by it. And these were in sort of like more low income neighborhoods where sometimes the parents didn't speak English really well, or sometimes they didn't have the tools at their disposal. So they kind of shied away from tech. And so I really liked kind of doing that volunteering, but it also kind of helped me really, I think, appreciate it. And it's so easy when you work at a place like Google to take all of that for granted, to take Wi-Fi for granted, to take the products that we have for granted. And so I wanted to kind of figure out a way to tie in my experience at Google, like being able to build products and do it for like a population, or a set of circumstances that maybe like were different than what I had experienced. So that was sort of like the motivating factor for going back to graduate school, getting my master's in education and MBA. I really liked my time at Flatiron School. It was really fun to kind of build out the learning platform that was utilized by all the students to learn to code, to do to learn data science and cybersecurity. Ultimately, for me, when COVID happened, my world changed a lot. Like I started just working from home every single day in perpetuity until we figure out what happens next. And I just also thought that that was such a unique opportunity. I mean, Facebook, what is arguably, whether you like them or hate them, they're still a major platform in connecting people all around the world. And so for me, that's, I think, a lot about what makes learning really effective. And one piece of it that's always been missing for me, and I got a taste of it at Flatiron School, is I think people holding each other accountable, and the social nature of human connections is highly important for effective learning. Like, that is the difference between a piece of like a textbook and a tutor. Like, that delta is there because of the human connection that's made, that you have. Like, if you have to go in front of someone and say in front of a class and be like, yeah, I didn't do that report. That's way harder than if a bot said that to you. And you know, like, so that's always been really interesting and kind of in the back of my mind in a lot of the work that I've done. And so with this opportunity in general with Facebook, I think that that's like a real opportunity to figure out how do you take these really social network tools and like engagements. And I would love to like learn from that and bring that into the learning context. And so that's kind of the abstract reason sort of joining Facebook in this work that I do. Now, my particular projects are sort of like wide ranging, but one of the big themes right now is so much of what Facebook employees have been utilizing to learn has been in-person experiences. And so one project that I'm working on is really thinking through for the whole Facebook learning teams, how to bring all of that online and how to do it in a thoughtful and effective manner. Like, it's sort of the similar example to how MOOCs came about. Like, what we're in the business of is not to just digitize content, like, oh, you did this in person and now just move all the content online. It's actually to kind of natively build a great learning experience for people who are no longer together in person. And so that was really exciting. And I think the other part was Mark Zuckerberg, right after COVID kind of impacted the US, made a pretty big proclamation that he really would like to see Facebook become this very remote forward company in the next 10 years. Like, almost half the employee base he sees being potentially remote workers. And so I also thought I would benefit from kind of being a part of a transition like that at Facebook scale. I think that that's a really unique experience in like a timely way. Like, there's very few companies that's made such a big commitment for the size of a employee base. And so that was like an opportunity to kind of almost like firsthand experience what remote work was, but also be part of like kind of solution defining what that looks like in the future.
That was really inspiring, especially the part about tutoring those kids in Brooklyn and their parents. So I feel like that really ties in well into our next question. So as the world is becoming more remote, especially education for high schoolers and also for in terms of work, what are your thoughts on how our K-12 education is run today, especially in the context of COVID-19? And what do you think you can do in terms of what you do at Facebook to help improve that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to say. One of the things I can definitely share is having sort of studied K-12 education, higher education, and then worked in sort of adult learning spaces like professional learning. They're quite different. Like, they're very different beasts. Like, if you talk about K-12, it's a highly sort of can be very politicized, can be very bureaucratic. It really has, like, especially US kind of K-12 education, it's a really regulated space to be in, versus in higher ed, there's such a delineation between privately funded and publicly funded schools. And so I don't think I would be able to kind of confidently say, like, I know what's best for those. I definitely empathize a lot with just all teachers today who are being asked to do like a really hard thing, which is put their own lives at risk for their students if they're going in person, and to also make teaching work remotely, virtually, and be on video all day long. Like, neither option is a good one for teachers, I would say. And then having kind of worked firsthand with a lot of teachers, it's just such a tough job. It's like acting. I always say it's like a performance that you're on. Like, you have to be fully on, and the especially younger students, but like all ages. It's entertainment. It's in a lot of it has to be super engaging. And so I don't really have like super commentary on like kind of what it should be like. What I do think we need to do more of is putting in, and so tying to kind of your second part of your question of just like, okay, what's Facebook doing? I can't speak for like Facebook as a whole, and it's still really new, kind of me being in my role. But I would say like my perspective is like we have to get some of our fundamentals right. Like we have to solve sort of like infrastructure challenges. We have to make sure that like teachers and students are equipped with the right tools, equipment, like computers and all of that. Like all I think one thing that I always am humbled by is like learning is not just about the content. Like there's so many things that like encompass a learner to make learning effective. That's, do they have, you know, all their other needs met, which is like, you know, do they have like a quiet, like think about like all of, I mean, you guys are students, so I think this is just sort of like me preaching to the choir, but like you need to have your like setup, you need to have a quiet space to do your work, you need to actually be, you know, ready to go, and you need to be like not hungry. Like that relates to learning and that relates to work. And so whatever we do, I think with the current experience we're in, I think one thing we need to get right is like how do we help people ensure that it's like a even playing field for the tools and infrastructure to make learning happen, because we can't control a lot of the other pieces of it.
Thank you. Yeah, great. So in regards to that, so let's in other than the fact that, you know, the kind of the level of the playing field isn't really level for everyone, and there's different levels of access to technology that exist, you know, across counties, and even within the same school, there's way differing levels of access. What do you think is the biggest hurdle in making remote education match the quality of, you know, an in-person education, or at least get very close to? So what aspect do you think is missing in remote education right now?
I mean, the main thing that I think is missing, and this definitely, I think it was the case at Flatiron School and at Facebook, is we haven't really solved for how to translate content well from in-person to online. I mean, it's a constant challenge, because I think there's a natural tendency all of us have of let's just do what we did, but like move it online. And especially with COVID, we did it really in like, you know, had to do it overnight. Like there was this, you know, continuity of the learning experience that everyone was committed to, and for all the right reasons. But now, and I keep kind of finding the teams that I work with now, now that things are not quite like steady state, but definitely like kind of we know what tomorrow will look like kind of state, we need to kind of still take the same amount of energy that we took to just like make it work, to make it better. And I think that that's really hard. I mean, like that's like an expertise that we haven't really like. Um, I work in this space because it's almost like kind of new, and like kind of I get to be a part of like defining what that looks like. So it's just sort of saying like, what is that exercise that we used to do in person, and how do we actually effectively translate it online? And that both takes into account like, well, what is the content? What is the infrastructure that people have? How will we know what tools and Wi-Fi and all of that people have? How will we know that they are equipped to use these technologies? What are the features of that tool? Like I spend a lot of time with our teams understanding and identifying the actual tools we need. Like for example, we're on a Zoom call right now. Do we need to use the you know, reactions feature? How will that actually make the learning experience more engaging? Would it be better if right now we all thumbs up to the audience? And so those are sort of interesting things, because usually there's, in terms of building a learning experience, someone who creates the content, and then another person who delivers the content like to a live audience, and then a third person who's like the technology person who's like building the feature or selecting the feature. And where I sit in the role, and where I think is really valuable in just sort of like I would say like in my kind of own learning experience being in ed tech for the last, you know, 5 or 6 years, is that it's all three of those things coming together to make for a really great experience. if the tech isn't there, the learning can suffer. If the person facilitating the thing doesn't know how to use the tech, or if they're having a lot of challenges with the content and not mastering it, they'll have a hard time delivering it. And if the content person doesn't know what platform it's going to be served on, they're going to have this disconnect because they're going to ask everyone to physically raise their hand because that's going to be in the script when there's actually a tool there. And so it's actually, in my mind, the triangulation of these three types of roles. And I see my role as making sure that we think about all three when designing a learning experience. Sorry, that was a long-winded way to say is like, there's not like this like bulletproof solution, but I think that what's missing is the conversation that's happening between these three different types of roles or people in order to actually produce a really great remote digital learning experience.
Great. Since you didn't, since the role at Facebook is pretty new, I wanted to basically ask you, how did you do kind of try to develop that platform at Flatiron? You know, you worked with the product team to build that amazing educational experience for both students and teachers. And you mentioned that triangle where, you know, you have the feedback and communication between different aspects of the learning experience. So what resources did you work with to help achieve that goal at Flatiron?
It's a great question. I think like a lot of just being really humble to other people's jobs and the challenges, like empathetic about just like what they do. I would say just very tactically, because I always like to try to be practical, mapping out user maps. Like I think sometimes when I think about like when a typical person says like, oh, you're a product manager, like what product do you have? Like there's in most things you sort of say, oh, well, this mouse is a product, or this Zoom as an application is a product. What's really interesting about working in ed tech is the product, as I would define it, is the learning experience. So it's kind of all three of those things. So it's actually mapping out, we call them like a services blueprint. You can kind of Google that, but like it's sort of mapping out the user journey, both from the end user, which is like kind of the learner's view, but also how does it get delivered? Because most likely it's not through just the digital piece, which yes, that was like in my last role, what I worked on, just like the digital piece of the learning experience, but having a deep understanding of, well, how does the teacher interface with this tool? What data would be really helpful so we know if the learning is effective or not? And all of those things have to come together, like those three roles I identified. They have to come together, and I think a really nice way to understand that really deeply is to map it out. You can do this with a lot of things that you know you're experiencing today, which is to say, like, how does Chris set up this call? Like, what was behind that? What did it take to like source a speaker? How the notes, like you guys sort of do this, we all do it pretty second nature. It's just sort of like, okay, like step 1, 2, 3, and 4, but being able to map this out and understand that there's like multiple layers to a user journey, I would say is just like really critical for designing for learning.
Thank you for answering that. So we have about 5 more questions, I think, and I want to pass it to my friend Temu, and she'll be doing the rest of the question asking. Thank you. Thank you for answering all the questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, first of all, for answering our questions. I think just to add on to that, to elaborate further, I'm really interested in what your thoughts are about the progression of online learning in ed tech. Do you think that schools now should be incorporating a bigger percentage of their budgets or of their educational tools into online learning?
It's a good question. I don't think online learning is a silver bullet to a lot of challenges in education. I do think it needs to be part of every school's toolkit. Obviously, for the worst case scenario of like what we're all encountering, like this is not going to, like as we become a more global, community, this is not going to be the last of challenges like the one we're in right now. So I do think it needs to be part of the toolkit. Something I said also earlier, something I truly believe, which is I don't believe online learning has to be like a less than solution than in person. I think that there's hugely important value to being really good at online learning. And I sort of champion those internally at Facebook and at Flatiron School. Some examples of that is like online learning can be more inclusive. If you build for these tools to be really accessible, it means that people who have to do childcare or caretaking of families can opt into, this is for adult learning, but you can kind of see the analogies, but like you can opt into learning instead of having to travel. Like so much of professional learning happened a lot at Facebook. And also when I was at Flatiron School, people were opting out of the learning experiences that were maybe available to them because they would have to travel to go do that. Flatiron School, for example, had a ton more female students, mothers in the program because they were able to do it remotely and from home. So it can be a really much more inclusive learning environment. You also have the benefit of like not needing physical space. That's a huge challenge for businesses today. Renting space is just a huge cost and line item to any business, right? And so if you are able to have the flexibility to do it without thinking about like, well, can we fit 50 people in the classroom? Like that's a huge like business prop that people are now, I think, more and more thinking about. And then there's just like the operations of it that I think are easy to miss. Like there's, people complain a lot about like, oh my gosh, like I'm overwhelmed by a Zoom call. There's so many like tools and reactions and screen share and chat. Like being able to kind of up level skills around that is no different than if you've entered into a new classroom and you have to figure out how the whiteboard or smartboard works or where the pencils are. It's just a different orientation. But then you have like so many more tools of collaboration at your fingertips, which I think is really cool. We can take a new hire orientation or like a town hall at Facebook that's maybe 1,000 people, and suddenly we can make 200 breakout rooms with like, I can't do the math, but you get the point, like 20 people in each. Like you can do some really cool things. To do that same experience in person would be like a half day, full day exercise. Okay, everyone go to your rooms. Oh, do we have enough rooms? Like whose room? Like, oh, you're in the wrong room, you have to go. Like, so I'm really about like trying to make sure that we identify what those opportunities are and then having the conversation with the learning teams about, well, what makes sense for your learner population? If those were just 3 of many examples, if there's advantages of that to make learning more inclusive and accessible, then I'm all for it. And I just want to see more organizations or districts just have those capabilities, have people on their staff that think about those things and can kind of like push those opportunities, versus where I think the challenge today is people see online learning as like the backup. It's like the worst case scenario, we have this to fall back on. And when we think about it from that lens, I think people just can't get excited about it. They dread doing it or participating in it. And so that's tough for me to sort of be able to not obviously convince everyone that there's some really great opportunities with online learning.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a great point. And also to that point of convincing others, even in terms of allowing other people to access things that were once not accessible to them. Can you speak more about your thoughts of how you can incorporate like emotional and mental well-being into the online educational materials, not just for students, but in general, like adult learning as well?
Yeah, sure. I guess one thing I would also sort of, or one observation that I've had is, I think there is a natural tendency also with trying to bring something that's in person online to say, okay, well, we're going to communicate the same way. We're going to all have our cameras on and we're just going to all have to talk to each other. Well, I have actually observed firsthand that there's actually, you know, an opportunity for there to be multiple ways of communication that allows for others who maybe have had challenges with in person to communicate more effectively in a virtual environment, right? Like chat is a functionality that people may feel more comfortable using instead of kind of putting their cameras on and speaking to the camera. Voting and polling for things is just like a different physicality to it than maybe raising their hand in class. And so I think that there's just giving people more options is one way that I think has been more helpful. We've also definitely seen more of a opportunity for people, I mean, I would say at Facebook and at Flatiron School, people to develop more empathy for one another because we're connecting people not by their geographic location, but connecting people via sort of shared interests or even shared challenges like problem solving together. So at Flatiron School, you know, we would do a lot of pair programming with people who were maybe stuck in trying to solve the same problem in the curriculum, but were, you know, millions and thousands of miles apart from one another from very different walks of life. And that's just like a pretty cool opportunity, given that if we did the whole thing, which we did have like in person, doing those things in person, you kind of just by nature gravitate sometimes to someone who looks like you or someone who dress like you, and just like some of the more like physical elements that sort of make people group in different ways. It's just really natural and social to be that way in person, but I think in a digital format it almost becomes somewhat of an equalizer in that regard.
Yeah, thank you so much. And then just keeping in line with the accessibility, I think you talked a little bit about how when you had first started, you were doing a lot of volunteer work for maybe minority communities and helping them becoming more able to like function within online society, right? And while we're going online right now, there's a lot of push, especially with like underrepresented communities and online education, talking about accessibility and issues of like safety and issues of learning itself. How do you think that some of the challenges like accessibility in terms of like minority communities can be overcome, and how did you maybe deal with such issues when you were in Flatiron?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and it's one that I have like a very imperfect answer for. I wish I wish I could say we solved it. It's tough. It's really challenging. I think like the first step is and what my takeaway with my personal kind of volunteering experience is that you sort of have to understand it firsthand and see it. And so if you're not and I would say I'm imperfect in that way too. I don't see every community, I don't see every need, but to the extent that you can get out into the community and better understand and do the outreach in those places, I think that's like part one. Like you have to have it as an explicit goal, not an implicit, oh yeah, like, I would say one thing we spoke to, I mentioned earlier is like at Flatiron School, we had a really strong female community and a lot of like mothers who went through our courses. It wasn't like organic that happened. I think we did a really great job expressively sharing the options with and targeting those those communities as an example. At Flatiron School, I think like they did a good job of making those things more accessible through like various scholarshiping initiatives, outreach in those communities. A lot of just any kind of inclusiveness is just making sure people feel welcome and are explicitly like the people who are maybe in your sort of outreach able to sort of speak their language and understand where they're coming from. But the starting point is really just like deeply understanding that and seeing that for yourself. At Facebook, I think there is just a lot of emphasis, I would say, like firsthand, like there's just a lot of emphasis in diversity inclusion, and I by no means an expert in that area, but I think as you guys are might be job seeking and looking at where you want to work, I would just like make sure, and you can tell by how much the organizations not just like talk about those things, but walk it. Like, who are you interviewing with? And I gave some constructive feedback to some of the companies that I've interviewed with of like, who was on that interview panel? What kind of questions was I receiving? You can tell kind of like a company's culture and what values they have through that lens. And so I think that's where I've been both through the recruitment process and also now starting work there that at Facebook, that this is stuff that they care a lot about, and make an explicit effort to ensure everyone understands what it means to be inclusive.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was a great response, however imperfect it was really good. And I think I just want to know a little bit more about, I know Flatiron was acquired by WeWork. So how did that broaden the scope of students that you got to interact with? And what were some of the differences between the original in quotes, students who were attracted to Flatiron versus students and people that you got through the acquisition with WeWork?
Yeah, I mean, the WeWork acquisition was kind of interesting. Like it was probably not what I would have expected to happen when I first joined in that tech company, but it was a unique opportunity for Flatiron School to have a wider physical geographic footprint. So whereas like maybe my focus was more on like kind of the digital tools, and there was definitely an emphasis on like kind of the online learning component through using the learning platform. We also had a Manhattan campus. It was downtown in sort of Wall Street area. And when I think WeWork approached Flatiron School, they had a global reach. They had, WeWorks are everywhere. And so the opportunity was, while we were able to kind of grow through a lot of word of mouth, especially kind of New York based folks, we actually found that a lot of our online learners, and this kind of speaks to sort of the theme today, there was this almost like a halo effect of even our online student body. The great majority of them were sort of in the New York metro area. Maybe their commute was really long, like 2 hours, or maybe they had personal family commitments, like I've spoken of, where remote, like online learning was a better option, but they were still kind of in the New York area. And so one strategy for Flatiron School to have a bigger impact and reach was through this partnership with WeWork, because very quickly we became a global campus. We had campuses in a campus in London, we had a campus on the West Coast and in the South. And so that was sort of fueled by the ability for WeWork to very quickly help us kind of fold campus into their sort of WeWork growth plans. So, I understood that part. I wasn't as involved in sort of that geographic print growth. What I think it did change was sort of our product roadmap on the digital platform side to accommodate for things that we might consider for how we would deliver our learning in person versus online. And there were so many similarities, but there were differences. And so from like building out the tools for teachers, we just had to be a kind of different and approach for those two modalities of learning.
Yeah, thank you so much for answering that. That was really interesting, and also an interesting perspective from going from a smaller company to being acquired and broadening your reach. I think with these last minutes, I'm going to hand it over to Jennifer to see if we have any more interesting questions on the dory for us to talk about.
Yeah, thanks so much. So Lisa, thank you so much for spending your time here with us. I know the Xoogler students are really excited about this and I've learned a lot. So we have a lot of awesome questions here on the dory. I'm going to go ahead and start it off with Yara's question. And her question is, what do you think was the most valuable lesson you learned from getting an MBA?
Oh, good question. I mean, so many things I value from my MBA. I think the one, so I went to Stanford, and Stanford has this sort of mentality, which is, they have this question that says, like, why should anyone follow you? Like, if you're a leader, and MBAs are all about like leadership development. They asked this question in the beginning, and they're like, why should anyone follow you? And I thought that was like a very provocative question, because it does put into question of like, yeah, why should anyone pay attention to me and listen to what I have to say? And so I think that like over the course of those 2 years, I had a lot of chances to think about that, both, by myself, but also get feedback from my classmates and teachers. And it's something that I still come back to when I'm in any kind of work environment. When I was at Flatiron School and starting to manage a team and grow that team, I always would think about like, what about my experience or the way I, conduct myself, like, is worthwhile for someone to want to pay attention and follow me. And so I think there was that. And then even in my current role, as I'm like coming in new, but I'm sort of in charge of this like highly cross-functional type of effort where I don't have direct influence over anyone. There's no like person that says like, well, Lisa said so and that's why I have to do it, but I have to influence a lot of people. So that's like another test of leadership, to be like, well, why would someone want to follow my way of doing things when I'm the new person and they've been doing this old way, many years past. And so I think that was like a really good reflection point for me. And in the age of just like so much of, I think, all work, especially for a person of color, minority, a lot of like, kind of, if you're in one of those kind of populations, there's tons of also imposter syndrome when you don't always see people that look just like you in positions of power. I think it's important to think about and have like some conviction and confidence in the reasons why someone would follow you.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting and a very interesting perspective. I don't think we've heard that answer very often when we ask for what you've learned. So thank you. We have another question here from Kishi. And she's asking, you've said some really interesting things about how you're developing and improving educational experiences. She's wondering how and whether you also consider how to make these new remote tools more accessible to low-income schools and students.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have a great answer for this. And so far as like right now, my focus is really, as I mentioned, kind of internal facing to Facebook and helping kind of bring the company to a stable kind of remote learning. The backdrop of a lot of this work that I'm doing is I'm hopeful that some of the things that we're building for internal employees can be available to a larger kind of audience, external. And I will say that, like, for a lot of the controversies of Facebook, they do offer a huge amount of like digital tools out to the world for free. And so I think that that's where, as much as possible, they're thinking about how do we make really great digital experiences available to more people. I mean, that is sort of the business. So in that regard, there is access to these tools. And so, yeah, I'm driving towards like a more like kind of learning and development product roadmap. And hopefully in the next kind of couple of years, we'll see some of that stuff available to the public.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'll be excited to see that as it comes out. So we have another question from a student asking, How can users move away from mimicking in-person experiences virtually and towards readapting to the pros and cons of virtual interactions in the work/educational settings? How do we shift that perception globally?
Yeah, I mean, if you have I wish I knew the answer to that. That's what I'm like solving for, I think, every day. I think the shorter term stuff is like identifying those places where something doesn't translate really well. Like sometimes I think about my job as like I'm just like a translator. I think about like why something works really well in person, and then I think about what should we be doing differently for an online setting. So there's a lot of things that work really well for, I was today talking to someone about a learning and development sort of thing where they ask people to, it's called like, I think like the privilege walk. And so like you physically, in person, you walk forward, if you identify with some kind of privileged incident, and it's a very visceral emotional exercise. But you can't really do that super well digitally. And so then it's just problem solving about like, well, what does that look like where people can still feel that connection and physicality in a different way? So I think in the micro, like kind of day to day, I'm thinking about those challenges and how to like kind of translate really well. And then I think long term, to sort of change that mindset, it means doing the first thing really well. It means that people are surprised and delighted by the experiences that they have in a remote learning setting. It means that like when we do put new learning online out there, that they're really great, and like that I have a really high bar for what that might look like, because for those first impressions matter. Like what I worry about, what we've kind of gone through all as a whole society of like moving to virtual so quickly, is that we haven't had the chance to showcase the best of online learning, what it could be, right? And so I worry that a lot of learners as well as a lot of teachers are pretty burned out with a really subpar experience, and they are now like coming in pretty resistant to this. They think it's like I will never do this again. But this, there's a lot of people also who said, wow, like there's so many new things that I can do now because, I'm connected to new types of learners for work. Like it's like I can actually have like some new version of work-life balance because I can actually have lunch with my kid, like, so hopefully we're changing minds in the right ways, in positive ways, where people will have an appetite towards a future of doing, remote learning.
Yeah, I find that really interesting because I know almost everyone here can pretty much speak to the challenges of remote learning and how different people have taken it. So I feel like that's really interesting. So we have another question here that's asking, what types of jobs and experiences from undergrad helped you prepare for the professional world?
Great question. I mean, a lot of this is sort of just like, all advice. One advice about advice is all advice is going to be filtered through that person's individual kind of own experience. And so I learned that lesson, and I continue to learn that lesson because I'm always like, oh, what career advice should I get? But when you talk to anyone, it's just going to be filtered through like their own lived experience. And so for me, I took a lot of different types of internships, which I think now looking back was really valuable. I sort of took a marketing job at Coca-Cola. I did like a run at like, finance at Goldman Sachs, and it was just sort of like me trying different things out. So I would definitely encourage, and it's really easy. I went to Penn. So for those who know, like it's a pretty like intense like business professional school. And so there's such a desire for everyone to just like get on the right track. And like, if you do your junior internship, that means you'll get a full-time job. But if you do your sophomore internship somewhere, then you'll get the junior internship. Like I would, and it's hard to say, but like, I promise you, if you look at like kind of a lot of people's careers, like there's no just like one train track that you jump on and it just like always works out. I encourage everyone to, especially in undergrad, to kind of try a lot of different things, expose yourself to a lot of different jobs. One piece of advice that I often give is like, figure out like what you enjoy, what you're passionate about, what makes you really curious. Like if you love movies, just do the thought exercise with yourself, with your friends, with your teachers, or with your parents, and be like, okay, how do movies get made? Like, who does that? And that's like 10 jobs right there that you can be exploring. So take whatever is like a real passion point for you, and try to find and figure out like, what is that? Like almost everything, I know it sounds cheesy, but almost everything has like a role and a job to it. You just have to like kind of uncover that. And I'm afraid a lot of what I've seen in my own experience with higher ed is that like the career services department is not necessarily always like the best thought partner for that. That thinking you still have to do on your own. Where they can be most valuable is maybe exposing you to the right alums or organizations that do that thing really well. But you have to almost like go to them and say, yeah, I'm really interested in film. So like, is that a producer role? Is that a writer role? Is that a film, like a crew? Like, what are those jobs? Or is that someone in the finance department at these movie places? Like, there's tons of jobs, but thinking creatively about that is a challenge. I would say that that's something I didn't do well when I was in school. Like, even though I just sort of said, oh yeah, I did a couple of different jobs, but even just sharing that with you, I'm like, yeah, I did a pretty like typical set of like, oh, I did the marketing job, the finance job. It wasn't super creative in that regard. So I hope you guys do better than I did.
Well, yeah, that's really interesting. So I'm gonna go ahead and ask another question here. So what advice would you give someone that deferred classes until next fall? What would be worthwhile learning? What resources should we look at?
Yeah, I mean, I was actually just talking about this with my partner yesterday. Like, what a time to be in college or going to college. Like, this is such a bizarro time for all of you. I certainly feel for you. I personally would sort of take my last advice and just be like, what am I so excited about that I now have like a freebie? Like, no, like anywhere you go, like any job interview, whatever, like no one's gonna be like, well, what was that weird year that you had? Everyone experienced COVID. Like, there's just no way around it. So I would see like kind of the bright side of this. Like, I know you guys can't be with your, not having your like freshman year experience. You will have it. Just do it next year or do it the following year. Like, you will have it, but this is your freebie. So like, just like figure out what you're passionate about and like do that. Like, reach out to people, be like, hey, I'm like stuck in COVID land. Like, can you tell me more about your job? Like, can I do an internship? Can I do an unpaid, like, obviously everyone's in different circumstances, but if I were in your guys' shoes, I would really try to figure out what makes me excited and try to find a way to be exposed to that or try my hand in that. And I think you'll find a lot of people out there willing to kind of give you guys a preview into that world, or like an externship type of opportunity just to try something. There's just a lot of, I think, room for creativity this year, and it's your freebie because like most people will not be like, well, what happened to, like, that's such a unique opportunity you guys have right now that I certainly would for myself or for my kids, like have said like, yeah, go do that really different thing. Like, think orthogonally about it.
Yeah, that's excellent advice. Thank you so much. I think I'm going to round this out with one last question from Iris. And she's asking, why did you switch from product manager to education partnerships at Google?
I like to move around. I mean, I think this is sort of like a little bit of my theme. Like, when I first started at Google, and I met someone who was on her 10th year at Google, and I was like, oh my gosh, why are you like, how did you still end up here? And like, what advice do you have for me? And she was like, I just kept having something new that I could learn. And I think I always tell people, like, one of the big benefits of joining a bigger company, whether it's in tech, high tech or not, is as you build your reputation and do good work, more opportunities will come to you and you'll have the opportunity to kind of like move around. And so for me, I took that advice to heart, and I stayed at Google for as long as I felt like the thing that I was doing, I was learning a lot and enjoying kind of the work that came with it. And so that was, I wish I had like a really pure, good answer there. I started becoming interested in ed tech outside of work, which I talked about. And then this opportunity to be in a more partnerships role came about, and I like moved into it. And so it's sort of like the opportunity sort of knocked, and I kind of went in that direction. And was learning a new skill set. And I would say the same about my current role. Like, I was having a great time at Flatiron School, and there was so much that I was doing that was really interesting. But when you're at a role for like 4 years, you just want like kind of different and new challenges. And so I was kind of ready for that. I get to build and support learning at a scale that, quite frankly, is just so like 50 times bigger than, what Flatiron School was doing. That was really exciting. Like, I wanted to work at that scale. So that would be my advice kind of to everyone, to think about, always pick the thing that you can learn the most from. I know it's like kind of like a education talk, but I'm going to be cheesy and end with that. Like, always pick the thing that you can optimize learning for, especially early in your career and in education.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much, Lisa, for your time today. I know everyone appreciated it. And thank you, Chris, for giving Tamu and Himsma, I'm so sorry, the opportunity to co-moderate this.
No worries. Thank you so much, Jennifer, Hamza, and Tamu. And Lisa, if you don't mind, I want to ask you one final question, since you're the expert in this space. For a lot of our students are really interested in the education field, as you can see, so the large attendance. What are your favorite education companies today that they perhaps should explore looking for an internship, just follow along, or jobs? And perhaps we'll leave that as our final question.
Yeah, I mean, I will, I guess I'll tweak sort of my response. I won't suggest like one company, just because I think it really will depend on sort of like where the interest area. Like, there's so many great companies in K-12, higher ed, and also adult learning to consider. One great resource, if you're interested in the ed tech space, that when I started, I valued a lot and still do, is kind of a media company called EdSurge, EdSurge. EdSurge just covers ed tech news better than anyone else kind of out there. And they're really at that intersection of like, what are interesting and impactful things, companies in education, but they also cover a lot of like kind of startups and others. And so I would just say, EdTech is like such an awesome space to be in. It's a lot of really rich people problems and challenges. You get to solve for like equity and access, inclusion, and it's like important. And it actually is like, you get to define that. I think what I was really, when I sort of left Google, what I was more excited about than staying at Google was being able to define that. We truly are in a place where there's so much technology available, but putting that right next to the solving for the right problems is like, I think, equally important for this space. And so I would just, if anyone's like interested in this space and want to chat more, I definitely I welcome that. So I hope some of you guys end up going into ed tech, and as current and more recent learners, like, I think you have a lot of rich insights into this that you can sort of bring to the table as well.
Thank you so much, Lisa. What an incredible resource you've been for the past hour, but also sharing EdSurge is a great way for a lot of the students to go explore further. We know you're really busy with helping Facebook design the future of remote learning, with onboarding so many new employees, but also training a lot of existing employees. So thank you so much for your time this past hour. Thank you to students, and good luck. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.